right, so if you have your Bibles, I'll have you open them up to Mark chapter 6. We're in this series called The Miracle Man. Jesus truly is, as you read through the Gospels, that's who he is. He is a miracle-working God, Savior. He's amazing. And we want to get intimately acquainted with who he is and what he's able to do in our life. So today, from Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44, I want to talk to you this morning about the need for flexibility. If we want to see a move of God, we will need to be stretched. So you know what happens in the body, right? When you haven't stretched, it gets tight. Your body, your muscles, your body, your muscles actually get short. If you don't get out and stretch, the muscles get short and they get tight, right? So I can always tell when my back is about to go out because my hamstrings get real tight. And it's all connected. And so I've been really trying to learn how to limber up, stretch out. And when you stretch, it burns. It doesn't feel good. It's not something you naturally want to do. You naturally want to just kind of settle, get sedentary. But if you do that, everything gets short, everything gets tight. Our spiritual life is much the same. Our hearts can get short, they can get tight, they can get small, they can get constricted if we're not stretching ourselves. And so when you don't stretch yourself, it reduces your range of motion and increases your chances of injury. You got to stretch your heart. You got to stretch your soul. You got to stretch your mind, and it takes intentionality in order to do this well. So today, our passage shows us the wonderful benefits of spiritual flexibility. Flexibility. Because as we start this passage out, we'll see that the disciples have this amazing plan, and Jesus takes it in a completely different direction. And thankfully, the disciples show a great deal of flexibility, and they see one of the greatest miracles of all time. And so in order for us to be able to see the glory of God, we got to gain a little bit of spiritual flexibility. You guys ready to get a little burn on this morning? Okay, so Mark chapter 6, we'll start with verse 30 and pick up the narrative there. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves." Now, this is at the tail end of the story we've talked about 2 weeks ago when they were all sent out on a mission, all the disciples, 2 by 2. And they go through all the villages there, and they're casting out devils and healing people and all these wonderful things. Last week we talked about the death of John the Baptist. And we finished the story today where they come back and report to Jesus all that they had done and all that they had taught. And Jesus says that they should come away by themselves to a desolate place and rest a while. So somebody say vacation. Say it again, vacation. This was a badly needed vacation. They were on the run. They were on the go. Go, go, go. And finally, Jesus comes up with an idea of them having some time away. A boat getaway. So these guys were wrapping up a very busy, very successful season of ministry, and now they were probably spent and exhausted, and it was time to get away and have some rest. So I like this section because it validates the concept of rest. It's a good thing. And if you don't rest, you're probably not going to stay in ministry for long. So you need to be able to schedule some time away. So put it on the schedule, get it on the calendar, plan to take some time off. This, I think, is a ministry principle. So here at Legacy, I try to really instill the concept of boundaries. Boundaries are a very good thing, and for the last 30 years, they've become more and more popular with books like Boundaries by Townsend and Henry Cloud, I think it is. These are concepts that we really need to get into our life. We need to etch out space for ourselves to be able to have time to breathe, reflect, rest. This is very, very good. So the whole concept of boundaries is having the ability to say yes, and then also the ability to say no. You got to be able to say no in order to instill a boundary. And for those who don't like to let people down, those who love to do ministry, this is a hard concept to learn. So we need to learn how to unplug and instill a sense of boundaries. Anne Lamott reminds us that no is a complete sentence. You don't need to explain. When there's boundaries in place, you can just you can just firmly say, I can't do that. I can't do everything for everybody. And for a person who really wants to do that, that's hard to do. No is a hard word to say, but we can learn how to say it. So Asa Don Brown says, boundaries are, in simple terms, the recognition of personal space. You got to have personal space. This is vital. This is important. So I try to train our staff at Legacy to build and maintain personal boundaries. Because if you don't have boundaries, you won't be in ministry for long. Boundaries and rest need to be a normal part of the rhythm of our life. If you put up that next slide, I have this principle up here. This is a good thing to do. Divert daily, withdraw weekly, and abandon annually. Every day you need to have a diversion. You need to have something for yourself, a space where you can just create for just you. I take a walk. Most mornings I'm out taking a walk. That's me time. That's me and Jesus. I'm just able to divert, get away. Sometimes I do it in the middle of the day. I get out and I go for a long walk. You need to be able to have that on a daily basis. Divert daily, withdraw weekly. That's called a Sabbath. You need to have a time. Doesn't need to be on a designated day, but take a day, take a period of time to unplug from the normal rat race of life. You got to have that. And then it says abandon annually. Take some time. Hey, just a week, 2, 3, get out of Dodge. Go do something fun. This is what maintains healthy rhythms of life. So verse 31 is an endorsement by Jesus to those who love to minister. Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. Doesn't that sound so good? So this was a great plan. Verse 31 was a great plan. However, I want you to check out what happens next. Again, we're talking about flexibility. Verse 33 says, now many saw them going and recognized them. Hey, those are those guys, 2 by 2. They've been going out casting out demons, healing people who are sick. Many saw them and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion. Had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Well, there goes the cruise. There goes the getaway. We had this thing all planned, and here goes Jesus again, having compassion on the masses. Perfectly good plans ruined. Vacation plans ruined. Sometimes Jesus takes a perfectly good plan, his plan, no doubt, and ruins it down the drain. And this requires, say it with me, flexibility. Following Jesus requires a lot of flexibility. There is a change of plans due to the need at hand. And the crowds were like sheep without a shepherd. He felt compassion for them. He sat down and he taught them. And if you look at the other Gospels, you know that this teaching right here that we see in verse 34 was the Sermon on the Mount. This was like the most famous of all of his sermons, and it lasted a long time. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 record the words of the Sermon on the Mount. That's what this was. And so you can imagine that the disciples were standing by and going, this was supposed to be our vacation. Anytime you see the Sermon on the Mount, watch the disciples on the side saying this, you've just ruined our trip. Flexibility. Flexibility. How are we with this kind of thing? How are we when we have our plans in hand? How are we when interruptions come our way? I had the day all planned out perfectly, and my wife calls with a flat tire. This is hypothetical. I had an itinerary all set out, and my kid gets sick in the back seat. I had the budget all fixed, and my neighbor gets an eviction notice. I had the vacation all arranged, and the church sprung a leak. I had all my buddies coming over to watch the game, and somebody calls with a dire need for ministry. Personal boundaries are good, but inflexible boundaries can be problematic. There's been a lot of talk in the last 20 or 30 years about boundaries, but I think we've taken the business way too far because we protect our boundaries at all costs, and we don't allow anybody else to bring a little bit of flexibility to our plan in the name of keeping boundaries. So sometimes we've got to be able to flip into the mode called, there's a long-time mentor of mine calls it ministry mode. We've got to be able to find our ministry mode. Whatever the circumstance, whatever the situation, we got to find our mode where we're able to do ministry, where we're able to give and serve and be inconvenienced and to be interrupted. This is called ministry mode, and we got to be able to find it. We all have this gear that we got to be able to easily shift into when the time calls for it. So will this church inconvenience you from time to time? Yes. Will your neighbors inconvenience you from time to time? Yes. Will your relationship with Jesus, your obedience to Jesus, inconvenience you? Yes. Just like your family does. And some reason we understand that the family does that, but anything outside the family, sometimes we don't always understand that. But we need to find a mode of ministry that we're able to move into people's lives, given the need at hand. So this doesn't mean that we throw personal boundaries out the window, but if we're never making sacrifices, we've taken the whole notion of boundaries way too far. we need to find some flexibility. The muscles from time to time will need to burn. We need to stretch ourselves and see what God can do through us. So, when learning to be flexible, our temptation is saying no when Jesus is saying yes. We have a great plan in hand, but in order to be flexible, we got to be able to say yes right along with Jesus when we really want to say no. But that's not our only temptation. Let's look at the next one here, starting in verse 35. And when it grew late, so much teaching, took a long time. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, and I love this, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" Kind of snarky. And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. So Jesus and his disciples in this little passage right here have 2 totally different attitudes. The disciples complain about what they don't have, while Jesus is focusing on what they do have. And do you hear the snarkiness in their tone? Do you want us to take 200 denarii and go get some bread? Now, a denarii is 1 day's wage, so this is kind of a lot of money. 200 denarii is like more than a half year's wages. So that would have probably fed the whole group. I think what they're saying here is that we don't have that kind of money. And if we had that kind of money, you're being a little bit ridiculous. You're going to take a half year's wages and go buy all this crowd some food to eat. And so when learning to be flexible, our temptation is saying no, right? When Jesus is saying yes. And our second temptation is saying can't when Jesus is saying can. How many loaves do you have? Go and see. Take some inventory. I want you to see what you have. And they come back and say, well, all we have are 5 loaves. A laughable amount. 5 loaves and 2 fish. This was pretty laughable. And oftentimes we look at our resources and say the same thing. How much money do you have? How much years experience do you have? How much time do you have? How many skills do you have? How many followers do you have? How much education do you have? How much influence do you have? You might have a laughable amount. But if we want to see miracles, if we want Jesus, the man of miracles, to show up, don't say can't when Jesus is saying can. Bring what you have, as little as it may seem, and put it in the hands of Jesus. This is how miracles start. This is how it happens. And so we can't say no when Jesus is saying yes, and we can't say can't when he's saying can. And that's what they did. Pick it up with me in verse 39. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass, and so they sat down in groups by 100s and by 50s, and taking the laughable amount, the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. And that's not counting women and children. It was probably about 12,000 people who all ate until they were all satisfied. Probably second and third servings from a laughable little amount. Don't you say can't. Jesus is saying can. Put it into the hands of Jesus and just simply watch. That's all they needed to do. Just simply watch what he can do with such a small amount. So if you want to follow Jesus, for us today, if we want to follow Jesus, we have got to be able to be interrupted when all we want to say is no. And we got to be able to be optimistic when all we want to say is can't. No and can't has made our hearts so small, so tight. Our hearts are so constricted because of this humanity that we live in, and we want to be, in the name of being practical. We do everything in the terms of being practical. We say no and can't, no and can't, and no and can't, and we're tight. And God is asking for some flexibility. And this is going to take intentionality on our part. We got to stretch ourselves. We got to put ourselves in positions to say yes when all we want to say is no. And we got to put ourselves in position to be able to say can when all we want to say is can't. We got to learn to be interrupted. We got to learn to be optimistic. Sometimes we get a little rigid in our boundaries. Sometimes we get a little rigid in our limitations. But paying attention to our boundaries is a wise thing. It's just not the ultimate thing. You hear me? And sometimes paying attention to our limitations is a wise thing, but it's not the ultimate thing. Following Jesus is the ultimate thing, whatever that might look like. That's the ultimate thing, not our principles. Principles, I think Oswald Chambers said, principles are what you have when you don't have God. Because all that you do is just live by your principles. And principles, hear me, are a good thing. I got principles. I want you to have principles. But if that's all we live by, then we don't have God. Because sometimes God will call you to do things that might be a little uncharacteristic if you're open to the moment and following Jesus. So if we want to see miracles, we got to learn to be flexible. That's what this whole series is about. The miracle man, if we want him to show up, we got to be flexible. 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 Our temptation is saying no when Jesus is saying yes. Our temptation is saying can't when Jesus is saying can. And sometimes being a part of the miracle requires a little flexibility. This is not an invitation to be reckless or to throw wisdom to the wind. There will be times to say no. And there will be times to say can't. But if boundaries and limitations reduce our vocabulary to no and can't, then we've taken it too far. But if we want to see miracles, then there will be times that we are called not to be so practical. Am I talking to anybody today? This story reminds us to give Jesus a chance to display what he can do in our lives. Do we want this? Then we're going to have to prepare for it. Like when you prepare for a race, you got to get limber, okay? We're endeavoring to see God show His glory, His power, His miracle working power. He can do this. I want to believe Him for the impossible, okay? And so we're going to endeavor to really press into these things, but I'm going to ask you to do some daily stretching. Can you do that? Can we get our hearts into places where we're able to say, yes, we can do that. I can do that. And to say yes when all we really want to say, the flesh at least wants to say, is no. So I'm wondering if there's anybody here who has taken this no thing and this can't thing too far. Boundaries and limitations are good things, but you've just perhaps taken it a bit too far, and you found your heart has grown small, constricted. You see it in your family. You see it in your marriage. You see it in your friendship. You see it in the times that you come together. Somebody that calls upon you for some help. And you got boundaries and you got limitations. You can't and you won't. And you say no far too often. You've been spiritually tight. Your heart's been too small. And you're ready to say, Lord, I want you to enlarge my heart. I need some spiritual flexibility. I like what Psalm 119:32 says. It says, I will run in the way of your commandments when you enlarge my heart. My heart's been too small. It's been too constricted. I need flexibility. Stretch me, Lord. Stretch me. I want to trust in you. If that's you this morning, I'm going to invite you to come up, confess that to the Lord. There'll be some people up here who will pray for you. We want to see miracles. Right? And in order to prepare ourselves, we're going to need to do some stretching. We need to gain some flexibility. This is a message of trust. Yes. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. If you need direction this morning, it's a trust issue. If you need provision, and all you have is just a laughable amount, that's a trust issue. He can do miracles through you. He can do miracles through us if we just find it in our hearts to trust. God is able. He is able to do exceedingly, abundantly, above all that we ask or think, but our hearts are too small, and they need to gain some flexibility. If that's you this morning, I'm going to invite you. We're going to stand to our feet here in just a moment. Sing this last song in response. This has been the Word of God. That's all we try to do here. I read the Word. I try to unpack the Word. I try to illustrate the Word. I try to apply the Word. It's all about the Word. There's no authority with me. All the authority is right here. And when God speaks, it deserves a response. This whole thing right here is a conversation. God's not just talking. We are listening and we are responding, and sometimes no response is a response. And that's a sign of a heart that's just gone too small. So now I'm going to invite us into a time of response. We're going to finish with this last song. I'm going to ask you to stand to your feet and talk to the Lord. Sing to the Lord. Pray to the Lord and respond. What is your response? And if you need some prayer, this morning, confess some things, feel free to do that. He's just asking us to stay flexible, and He will do the rest. Let's sing this last song.